Choosing the right Ableton Live controller can feel a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're new to music production, or you just don't want the hassle of regretting, reselling, and starting over again. Don't worry, I've done all the hard work for you. In this video, I'll break down the best Ableton Live controllers for every type of producer, from the high-end options right down to the budget-friendly. I'll also be sharing my recommendations of which controller I would buy if I was starting out today, also which controller is best for live and which controller is best for studio. So without further ado, let's get to it. On the table in front of me here, I have three Akai Ableton controllers. We have the legendary APC 40 Mark II, we have the new kid on the block, which is the APC 64, and we have the APC Mini. Just before we get started, in case you're wondering what an Ableton Live controller is, it's a grid-based controller that will control Ableton Live's session view, which is where you have the tracks in the vertical columns and you can press play on all the loops. Each one of these buttons here will launch or play one of those loops. On some controllers, you can also then flip it over so you can play it like a musical instrument, but not all of them. So let's go and find out which ones you can and can't. Let's start with the budget-friendly option, which is the Akai APC Mini. Now this is great for a beginner because it comes in at around about £77 UK pounds, which is very affordable. You can see here it has Ableton session view, ready to rock and roll. You can control the scenes down here with these buttons. But a fantastic feature is you have these faders here. Now you're going to see as we go through this video, other controllers that come in at that price point don't normally get these faders, and these are great for if you're trying to get hands-on with your levels, if you're mixing, but also if you're performing live. Now this does have note mode, which is where you can control an instrument. It also has something called drum mode, which is where you can play beats. Let me show you that. You hold shift and go to note, and it comes up here. Now, this is one of the cons of this controller. I'm not a fan of the size of the pads on this for playing. You see here, the pads are very thin and it makes it quite hard to get around it, okay? We also, if we hold down shift, we can go to drum mode, where it's a bit like note mode. You can play an instrument, but the pads are a lot more optimized for playing back one-shot drum samples. There is a couple of things that I don't like about this controller that you may want to consider, especially if you're going to be using this live. One thing is switching between note mode and drum mode is also a scene select. If I go back to session mode, if you do not hold down shift, it will launch that scene. If you ever played live before, you'll realize that sometimes you can just quickly do things on the fly. Holding down a modifier key like shift doesn't seem like such a big problem in the studio, but live, if you go, right, let's go to drum mode, you press that and you launch a whole new scene in a song, that can be disastrous, you know? So not having a separate button there is a little bit risky for me. Also, if you look here, hold down shift, you can decide what these faders control. So I go to pan, these are now doing the pans. If I take my finger off shift, it disappears. I don't know what these are controlling anymore. So it'd be good if that stayed lit up. Again, this is like minor things, but I think there's something to be aware of if you're thinking about getting this controller for a live situation. Now, plus side with a live situation is it's very small, it's very compact, and it can fit on a table with hardware simps very nicely. And with the added faders, you get that extra level of control. Now let's move on to its bigger brother, which is the legendary APC 40. Now this is a monstrous controller. As you can see, the size is quite big. Also, you have a lot of dials and a lot of control over Ableton Live session view. You've got faders, you've got your solo, arm record buttons, you've got your scenes, track select, and these fantastic encoders. Now, what's really cool with these encoders here is you can see what they're doing. Okay, so you can see this is doing pan, this is doing the sends. User, this is where you can go in and you can manually MIDI map the controllers to something. Now, nothing happens here because I haven't mapped them to anything. If I do sends, you can see here they light up. Now, this is a fantastic thing for live. You get the visual feedback of how much you've turned that up by. So you don't need to look at the computer at all. You can see that that send is all the way up, so you could pull it back down if you want to. You also have device controls, so if you have a device that's in a rack, The first 8 macros there will be controlling that. And you can obviously shift through banks and shift through devices. It's very hard to fault this for live. It's used by so many famous DJs, so many famous artists. It's fantastic. The bad thing is it doesn't have a note mode. So if you would like to play an instrument like this one here, you can't do this on here. That said, you only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scenes available. Normally on these controllers, you have, well, 8 tracks and 8 scenes. That's where this thing was made. It's the APC 64. It's basically taking the idea of the APC Mini and putting it inside the APC 40, making it a lot more like a push controller. So you have the session view overview, you have your scenes down here, you have your track select, then you have a separate button for note mode. You have something called chord mode, which is really handy feature to have. You have something called step sequencer, and then we have custom modes we can select as well. What's slightly different to this from this one is this one has rotary controls, and this one has these LED faders here. Now, this is a bit of a love-hate relationship I have with these. If you're new to this channel, you will not know that I'm not a big fan of this controller. I think the idea is there, but the execution has been poorly made in comparison to the APC 40, which is a really good, solid controller. This one, there's a lot of features in it, but they seem to be, well, not very good. For example, chord mode looks like a note mode, but then we can select the chord down here. If we press chord mode again, we can then go through and select the chord type. The chord mode isn't very intuitive. We don't really get many options on what inversions to do. We have a little tiny screen down here, which is nice to have a screen, but it's very fiddly to change things around and choose things. Also, it does have some CV output, so you can control all your modular equipment with this as well. So that is a good thing. Now, if we go to note mode here, if I choose a layout like this, this is how we adjust the settings of note mode, which if you're new to a grid controller or if you're new to the APC, what does that mean? You're going to have to do some menu diving and some manual reading or watch a tutorial to figure this all out, because it's not that intuitive how to set this up. This kind of looks like a keyboard, so I guess this is like the root key, you know, and then you've got scales and inversions, and unfortunately you're gonna have to do a bit of learning there. All in all, it's not a bad controller. I'm not a big fan of these. I feel like if you're reaching over, you might accidentally hit them, but it is kind of an advancement of this. For live, I just prefer this one personally. It feels it's a lot more like hands-on. There's no menu diving. There's none of these extra features like chord mode and step sequencer, which the idea is good, but it's, like I say, it's just not executed very well. Okay, so that's the Akai family. You can see there are various different pluses and minuses between these controllers. Now let's look at the Novation family, because the Novation family is interesting because they have a lot of features that the Akai APC 40, 64 and APC Mini have, but they have compacted it into a smaller space. So the Novations might be an Akai killer. Let's find out. Let's get them up and let's draw some comparisons. So now I have here the Novation Launchpad family. So we have the Launchpad Mini Mk3, we have the Launchpad X, and then we have the Launchpad Pro Mk3. They all look very similar. Obviously they get slightly bigger, and guess what? The bigger they get, the more expensive they get. So let's look at the budget-friendly option here, which is the Novation Launchpad Mini. Now you can see it is very small. It's a bit smaller than the APC Mini, but we don't have those faders. So we do have separate buttons for session, drums, keys, and then we have an amazing custom user section, which I will come on to in a minute because it's the same for all of these controllers. So this one comes in around £80, but you can get it a little bit cheaper other places. This one here comes in at around about £130 to £140, and this one is the most expensive one, so it's about £230 to £240. Now let's talk about the two main differences between these two, because they look very similar, apart from there's a kind of a few different options up here, but essentially they look exactly the same. Obviously the size is one thing. This one is obviously bigger, the pads are bigger, but the main difference between this one and this one is when you go into note mode, these pads and in drum mode are velocity sensitive. On this one, they are not. They are at a fixed velocity. So if you're looking at trying to play an instrument as well as launch clips in session view, this is not a very good option. It has a fixed velocity value. This one, however, is velocity sensitive, so I can tap it or play it hard. There's going to be some expression in there. So that's just something worth noting. If you think about getting this, you think, well, this one's £80, this one's a lot more expensive. I'm not too fussed about it just being bigger. There is that fundamental difference to think about. Now, the main difference between this one and this one is you can see here you'll have a lot more navigational control. So you can be away from the computer a lot more than this one. This one here, we have a bit of menu diving to access the parameters in live. With this one, we have buttons laid out ready to go, which can be good in a studio, but also in a live performance situation. We have a few more controls down the side here, like quantize, fixed length, record quantized options. And then we have a similar sort of function operations here, like session view, note mode. But then we have something called chord, custom, and sequencer. So chord mode is a fantastic feature on this controller. It's not on the other ones, and it gives you the ability to play chords without actually understanding theory. You have here the scale, and along each line you have certain scale degrees that play them together, they will sound good. You can then choose chords here that have different inversions, and you can save presets. You also have a sustain button here, so you can sustain, and also you can add notes on top of the chord, make your own chords, which is fantastic, really good feature, but that's not in the other ones here. So if you're looking for this infamous chord mode that Novation has, it's only on the Pro. Now it also has a sequencer, which can be used to sequence external MIDI gear. It has a MIDI mini TRS jack out and in, so you can use this as a standalone device to control synthesizers. Now this one here, I believe, yeah, you can't. So this one is a bit more for studio use, it's a bit more integrated, and these two are focused on the live situation here. Yeah, to summarize, you know, if you're looking for a grid controller that you just want to play the scenes and you just want to launch clips and not really interested in playing note mode, I would go with this one. It takes up quite a small space. If you're looking for something that integrates in the studio, not really looking for the controls of Ableton, you just want an instrument to play and launch scenes, but you want that velocity sensitivity, this one. And this one is the all singing, all dancing version, which has all the live studio integration you need. But there's one thing missing from this that the APC 40 had and the APC 60 would had, which is some dials, and faders are missing on all of these. So that might be something that kind of gets in the way of what you want to do. That's where this thing here, the custom mode, comes in. So if you look here on the screen, you can see it's a web-based app, and you can simply drag and drop buttons and assign them to do things. This is fantastic for using multiples of these controllers live. So you could have this as your main controller, then you could have this one set up as a custom MIDI controller doing faders and sliders. And that's where this one is fantastic, because it's super cheap. You can have faders which you scroll up and down like this, and then you can control things in live, but you've then got to buy two controllers. The other thing is you've got the visual feedback here. Seeing what you're doing in live can be a game changer. And that brings me on to the next bunch of controllers, which are Ableton Push controllers. Let's jump in and have a look at them. Okay, last but not least, we have the Ableton Push controllers. Now you can see they're pretty big. So big they don't fit on my table, so one of them's having to sit on top of two of them, unfortunately. So these are all the push controllers that were released by Ableton. We have the Push 1, Push 2, and the most recent, the Push 3. Now, the reason why I've brought up two discontinued products, What that means is you cannot buy the Push 1 or 2 brand new. You have to buy them on the second-hand market. The reason why I brought them up is because they are still valid controllers. They still work with Ableton Live 12, and you might be able to save yourself quite a bit of money by getting one of them. Now I'm just going to pull the Push 3 back so we can see the other two, and then I'll bring it back in a second. Now Push 1 was the first one, and it was in collaboration with Akai, the first set of controllers, so it is like a Ableton Akai controller. The pads are a lot more like the Akai pads, and you can see the layout is pretty much the same. The only real difference between these two controllers is some of the navigational buttons placements, the track select buttons, also the screen. The screen here is a lot more like an old Nokia 3210. You know, you got that old kind of screen, and then the Push 2 really kind of upped the game and gave you this really good visual display. With that said, you can still see a lot of things in Ableton Live by pressing these different view selectors on the screen, and you've got the same on here. It's just a lot more in detail on the Push 2. That said, you do not need a power supply for the Push 1. And maybe I should have mentioned before, sorry, you do not need a power supply for all the other previous controllers we've looked at. They just are powered via the USB you plug into your computer. Now moving on to the Push 2 and Push 3, you will need a power supply at some point. More on that in a second. With that said, the main features of the Push is grid mode, having session mode and note mode flipped over, being able to choose the scales, very intuitive to how you change the layout of the scales by just pressing scale. You can choose that, and then you can choose how the notes are laid out. It's very intuitive. Unlike the APCs and the Launchpads, selecting and choosing different scales is, well, it's not that intuitive. You have to look at the manual or watch a tutorial online. So you have your launch buttons here and you have your scenes, and the pads are very big and very good for live. There is not much change in the functionality between these two controllers, apart from the screen and obviously a few more slight improvements. But if you want a completely integrated controller for Ableton Live, you can pick one of the Push ones up for as low as, well, the lowest I've seen is £50. I got this one for £90 secondhand. They do go a bit higher, but think about that, that's the same price as one of the APC Minis or the Launchpad Minis as well, and you get a lot more for your money there. That's because it's discontinued, so unfortunately I can't guarantee a price for you on that one, but it is a good option for live and for studio use. Now that screen can feel a little bit outdated. If you are looking to use it in the studio, that's where you would look at Push 2, where you've got a lot more of that visual integration. Now Push 2 has also been discontinued because we've got this new bad boy Push 3. The main differences between these two are minimal. The main functionalities stay the same. The pads are a lot more of an improvement. They are a lot more sensitive, a lot more reactive, which is great. But we have the buttons, the pads, and the screen, which is great. This one you can pick up for anywhere from like £100 to £300, somewhere in between there. I've seen it go on eBay quite a lot for like £200 to £250, but also as low as £100, which is a really good option for the studio. I'm not the biggest fan of the Push when it comes to having the controllers for live. Having the controllers do multiple things depending on what you selected, for me, boggles my brain when I'm live. I like to just grab a controller that I know is mapped to a certain parameter and is not going to change. But for studio use, this is killer. Now, we've just got the Push 3 released. I think it was last year. It's this guy here. Now, if you notice, this is not plugged in at all. This is a completely standalone device that connects via Wi-Fi to Ableton Live, and I can transfer sets and projects to it. I can work on a project completely standalone at home on the couch having a cup of tea, and then I can just put it on the cloud, open it up in the studio and carry on working on it, which is a fantastic workflow. But this comes at a price. Now, a brand new version of the tethered version of the Push, which basically has no standalone capability, is around £879. Whew, that's quite a lot. When you put in the standalone capabilities, that's where the price shoots up. For the standalone version, it's £1,669 at present. You can buy the tethered version and then buy an upgrade kit at a later date, which turns it into a standalone, and it's DIY, super easy. That's what I did. If you want to see how I did that, there is a video up here on how you do that. But essentially, the functions of the Push 2 and Push 3 remain the same. Other than the standalone upgrade, the main thing is you've got MPE pads. You have an audio interface built in, so you can connect this to the computer and record instruments directly in. You have a lot of MIDI I/O. You also have ADAT, and you have CV capabilities. So this is really a studio powerhouse. Now, the main thing that sets the Push controllers apart from the previous controllers is you really do not need to be looking at the computer or touching the computer at all with a Push controller. The idea behind the Push controller is you're in the studio, you're making a song, and you're playing Ableton Live like an instrument. That's why you have the dials, the screen, everything's big and everything's at hand, which is fantastic. That concludes our journey through Ableton Live controllers. So which one do I think is the best budget-friendly controller? Best budget-friendly controller, I think, for someone starting out is either the Push 1 for studio use. If you're looking for one for live and studio use, I recommend the Launchpad X. It's just very compact, it's very durable, it doesn't feel too plasticky, and it's relatively cheap, like 100, I think it was like 130-ish pounds. Not too bad at all. And you've got that velocity sensitivity. Now the APC Mini, not 100% sure on the velocity sensitivity on that, I have to check it, but the Launchpad Mini doesn't have the velocity sensitivity, and that will limit you at some point, as I have found. I've got it in my live setup for just launching clips and scenes, but there have been occasions where I want to sequence a drum or play some notes, and the keys are very small, and without that velocity sensitivity, it doesn't sound right, basically. So I would go for the Launchpad X. So now, which one would I recommend for like studio use? I would absolutely recommend the Push 2. You're going to get a lot of bang for your buck. What I mean by that is there's a lot of features for the price. Its main competitor is the APC 64, but it's really not that intuitive. It's really not that well laid out. You know, I have a love-hate relationship with that controller. I really don't think it's I don't think it's very good. I think the idea is great, but the execution is bad. You can see in this video up here where I completely tear it apart and say why I don't like it. But I think the Push 2 secondhand would be a very, very good option. The Push 3, obviously, I'm a bit of a fanboy for it, so I do think it is a good option, but I understand the price tag of a standalone Push being nearly £1,700. It is pricey, but I have now got it and I do use it loads. I love it much more than Push 2. I'm making a lot more music on it. I would suggest looking on the secondhand market. For a Push 3, you can get them for around about sometimes £1,000, which I still far from ideal, but it's a lot cheaper than £1,669. There's one other one that I would recommend for live. The one I recommend for live is this guy. Ding, 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 ding. Is the APC 40. If you are looking at performing live, like doing a DJ set or just using Ableton in a live situation, this is so good for the money. It's about the same price as a secondhand Push, but having dedicated dials, like clicking on user and knowing these dials are going to do something that you've mapped to them, is fantastic. And you've got lots of dials here. You've got all these 8 here, which will be automatically mapped to macros. So you can manually set the macros in live and then control them. You have then got this user bank. You can turn it sends, pans. You've got your faders. You really don't have to do much menu diving, which you understand if you play live. Menu diving is not a thing you want to be doing. That's where the Push 1, 2, 3 get you stuck. Okay. Yeah, that concludes it. There's a few options there. I hope you find a controller that's right for you. Hopefully you've seen through my mistakes which ones are right for different situations. There's no right one for every situation, but hopefully this video will inform you which one's right for you. If you do decide to buy one of these controllers, I have an affiliate link in the description below or on the screen here. You will see in that link all these controllers featured in the video today. If you purchase it to that link, I will get a small commission, which will help support this channel, but there will be no additional cost to yourself. Now, if you would like to dive deeper in between the main differences between the Push 2 and 3 controller, I have a video here where I do a side-by-side comparison and do the ultimate showdown between the two heavyweight Ableton controllers. Take care and see you in the next one.